The Clinton administration has done absolutely nothing to try to go after these guys that shot down the pilots and Brothers to the Rescue.
So I think there's this obsession with this old, decrepit military leader who has been in power for 41 years.
I can call him a tyrant and a dictator.
Call the police, get some help, we're being attacked by Cuban diplomats. They were making obscene gestures at us through the windows of the Cuban intersection. The way that they reacted to us is the same exact way that the Castro regime react to any kind of protest.
The worst is Lucia Newman, but that's a given because she's in Cuba and she's got to abide by whatever Castro says.
The media's been able to be manipulated.
The one media person I was very disappointed in was Geraldo Rivera.
The media in this country is very supportive of the left.
In the early 1960s, Cuban parents sent 14,048 Cuban children unaccompanied to the United States. Known as Operation Peter Pan, it was the largest secret exodus of children in the Western Hemisphere. It was in reaction to the new Cuban government's program to overwrite the parental prerogative and establish routine communist indoctrination of children. According to the new Cuban Constitution, enacted after the Castro Revolution, the state controls the raising of children. It dictates that all children from elementary school through university be indoctrinated to follow, participate in, and promote the goals of communism. Education is to be geared to the formation of what it calls the communist personality. Article 5 of Cuba's Code for the Child and Youth reads in part, "The communist formation of the young generation is a valued aspiration of the state, family, teachers, and the political and mass organizations that all act to foster the ideological values of communism in children."
Y darle un beso y un abrazo a nuestro invicto, imborrable e intachable comandante en jefe, Fidel Castro.
Cuban parents continue high-risk attempts to leave Cuba with their children for a chance to live in freedom.
I noticed a hand move. That's when we sped over to this inner tube, and my cousin dove into those rough waters, and he held that inner tube by the boat there, and I tried to hold myself without falling into the water, and I plucked a little Eliancito out of the water, and into my arms. The first thing I said, do you speak English? And he just looked at me with his eyes wide open. Tu hablas español? And he said, sí. I just held him in my arms like a mother would hold her child, and I knew that he lost his parents. And the first thing I did was to try to comfort him, and I kissed him and held him and just tried to treat him like if I was his mother, because I knew he must have lost his mother out there in the water.
No one can doubt that Elian's mother was a very courageous individual. To get on a small boat, travel those 90 miles across the Florida Straits, that takes no small courage. I think it's a terrible tragedy that she didn't make it. Life is filled with tragedies. We may never know exactly what was in her heart or in her mind when she made that voyage, but I tend to believe that she couldn't have been so different from so many other Cubans who have made that voyage, that she could not have had the same motivations that they had, which was to bring their children to a greater place, which is America.
She gave her life so that her son could be free. The media has even, when they do talk about the mother, they've even gone as far as to allude to the idea that, well, she left because her boyfriend wanted her to leave. I've never been on a raft in the Florida Straits. I've never been on a raft in the middle of the night with sharks swimming around me, with nothing in the horizon except blackness. I've never been there, but so many Cubans have been there and have died there, and they know what that's about. Those who have experienced it and have arrived here, those who are on the island and know of the people who have left. You don't get on a raft with your son in the middle of the night because you want to hang out with your boyfriend.
The story of the child brought to freedom by a mother who sacrificed her life for him became obscured, became forgotten, really, I think. As time went by, Elian's mother and her desires for her child were forgotten by the American public.
The media in this country has really not focused on the true intentions of the mother, which were to take her son no matter what, to take him to freedom. Being on that raft and risking dying are better than staying in the oppression that there is in Cuba. And the media hasn't talked about that.
And part of the reason for that was that Elian's narrative, the first narrative, was not scripted. It was equivalent of raw video footage. You had there what you had. You had the Cuban American community, warts and all, gathering around this child, rallying around this child, supporting him. And you saw the good and the bad of the Cuban American community. You saw people who genuinely cared for the child, and you saw some people who may have been taking advantage of the child. You saw a very caring family which had difficulties in the past. What you saw in Miami was the Cuban American community as it is, with its faults and its virtues. What you saw of the second narrative was something that was very carefully scripted and very carefully manipulated to conform to what the writers of that narrative expected the American people would respond to. But that second narrative was something that was authored by very few people who had no connection to this father and this child prior to this tragedy of the child's mother drowning.
The Black Caucus in the United States goes down to Cuba, and they associate with Fidel Castro. They were just there recently. And we have Sheila Jackson Lee, Maxine Waters, those elected officials. They defend Fidel Castro. They criticize those in this country who disagree with the communist regime. The National Council of Churches have had a history of working with Fidel Castro through the Reverend Joan Brown Campbell and other avenues, but their agenda is overwhelmingly political to the left. They support oppressive regimes such as Castro's.
Joan Brown Campbell has very clear agenda in returning Elian to Cuba. For one, it was the greatest public relations victory for the communist socialist left in this country, because they were able to say, look at these Cuban Americans. They're irrational, arrogant, they're intolerant. And I think that was a very intentional strategy that the left was able to capitalize through their friends in the media, to their friends in the government. When the grandmothers were flown from Cuba to New York City, I myself called Pastors for Peace and the National Council of Churches, and I asked them, why are you guys doing this? I'm a Cuban American, and I'm not calling out of hate, out of hostility. I just really want to understand, why are you guys doing this? The person's answer was, we don't have to explain anything to you because Cuban Americans see it differently, and that's that. And I said to her, well, what about the Human Rights Watch's report on the human rights abuses in Cuba? What do you think about that? Have you read that scathing report? She said, no, it's not so scathing. It's not so bad over there. As a matter of fact, there's human rights violations here. So I think the left tries to justify the human rights violations in Cuba by pointing out to civil rights violations in the US, which, if you think about it logically, makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't follow.
Citing peace, humanitarian causes, and their desire to help the Cuban people, there are groups of Americans whose efforts support the Cuban government and block Cuban citizens working for democracy. Together, they form a network in the United States that supports Castro and his efforts, such as the return of Elian Gonzalez to Cuba. An important part of this network is the National Council of Churches. Known as a religious group, it has a long history of pro-Castro activities dating from 1959 to the present. The National Council of Churches, Reverend Joan Brown Campbell, who played an important role in convincing the American public of the need to return Elian to Cuba, has exhibited a well-defined pro-Castro political agenda. Reverend Campbell has never publicly shown concern for Cuba's history of human rights violations. She has offered only praise for Castro's revolution during her repeated trips to Cuba as an official guest of Castro's government. She has spoken at political rallies in Cuba, in one of them using Jesus Christ's name against the U.S. embargo, stating, "It is on behalf of Jesus the Liberator that we work against this embargo."
Joan Brown Campbell is affiliated with National Council of Churches. National Council of Churches President Andrew Young is a board member of Archer Daniels Midland Corporation. ADM is represented by the same law firm that Gregory Craig works for. And Gregory Craig, of course, represents Juan Miguel Gonzalez, in essence, represents Fidel Castro. And of course, Gregory Craig is also friend of President Bill Clinton and represented him during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I've researched this and found out during the Elian Gonzalez case, all these groups and people who have come together behind the scenes working to get Elian Gonzalez home for ulterior motives. So we have President Clinton, National Council of Churches, Joan Brown Campbell, Archer Daniels Midland Corporation, and Gregory Craig, of course. All these people are connected for different reasons. So for financial gain, for political reasons, for communist reasons, for left-leaning reasons, all these people have come together and worked behind the scenes. But what we see as the American public, what we see through the media is simply individuals who are, unaffiliated and who come across to us as caring for their own reasons when we really know the truth.
We all always argue that we believe that the father and the child should be united. Our main concern was Elian returning back to a communist country, a country in which he will not be able to speak freely, a country where we know that human rights violations occur, where we know that there's no sense of democracy or no sense of freedom. And in this country, when we look at the United States, is yes, Juan Miguel does have rights over the child in the United States. Once a child, Elian, is returned to Cuba, Juan Miguel loses all rights over that child.
The laws in Cuba are very clear. The family code and the children's code is very clear that ultimately the state is the one that decides.
And that, from the beginning, was always the message that we carried and the message that we wanted the American people to understand.
Juan Miguel Gonzalez is not going to have control of Elian's life and of his future. And that's what's sad. The American people haven't been told about this.
In Cuba, children are custody of the state. Parents serve the purpose of, in essence, babysitting. They babysit these children, but the thing is that in this country, people aren't focusing on that. They're not focusing on the fact that Juan Miguel has no custody of his son. The communist regime has custody of his son. But this country doesn't see that because Greg Craig, National Council of Churches, Joan Brown Campbell, and the left-leaning media have all come together to make sure that that image does not get out, that the truth does not get out.
The Elian affair affected me as a Cuban American in a very real way because I saw the great need to educate the American people of the sad reality in Cuba.
I want the American public to realize that the Cuban community is hurting, and we are not these emotional radicals, right-wing mafia, as we feel we're being depicted. We are human beings who have experienced a loss of a country, loss of freedoms, and who in a lot of ways had to leave a communist country in search of a better life, just like the many immigrants who came before us. And we want to communicate, or I want to communicate to the American public, that Elian was just one example of what we fear the most, which is sending young immigrants back to a communist country where the boy will have no rights to speak, no right to even think for himself. And that still exists. And I think that the American public needs to understand that military dictatorship still exists, and we cannot stay silent. We cannot keep quiet. And again, Cuba is just one of the many examples. There's Tibet, there's Sudan. We are not the only community out there that's hurting, and we need to deliver that message to the American public.
I think from the Elian affair, the Cuban Americans have realized that they have to take their message out beyond Miami. I found it very shocking. I think most Americans understand that Fidel Castro is not, see Fidel Castro in a favorable light. However, they don't understand what he's capable of or what living in Cuba is really like. And I think the most shocking thing for us is to realize that there are a lot of people who don't know what our families have gone through and what life is really like in Cuba. I think the most important thing for us is to realize that we have to take our message out and we have to gain support from the American public and the international community, because without them, what other support can we get?
The Cuban American community has a history of being a law-abiding community. I think it's one of the most patriotic, if not the most patriotic immigrant group ever to arrive on U.S. shores. And I think Cuban American community understands that one of the elements of patriotism, a big element of patriotism, is obeying the laws. At the same time, they also understand that they have rights as citizens to demonstrate when they perceive an injustice or when they believe the laws are not being applied fairly. And this is really what I think the Elian case bears out, was an unequal application of the laws. We're looking at an administration that has flaunted the laws left and right, and yet in the case of this child, it decided to apply the laws, really even to exceed what the law said they could do, in order to advance its own political interests. There have been other scandals during the course of the administration, many other scandals, but I don't think any of those had the implications and the consequences that this one did. I don't think any of those scandals affected the lives of people in the way that this one did. The consequences were so severe.
President Clinton has always maintained a position of not fighting against the Cuban government. So that there were possible negotiations that occurred between Clinton and Castro's government, I believe that there is that huge possibility, as seen through the Judicial Watch emails that they collected, documents that they collected from the INS.
On December 13, 1999, at the St. Martin Parish Jail in Louisiana, 8 Cuban inmates took hostages, demanding their own release to another country. These inmates were among the 2,700 jailed prisoners that Castro sent to the United States in the 1980 Mariel boat lift. Since their arrival, Castro had refused to accept their return to Cuba. However, on December 19, 1999, the Clinton administration's State Department announced that Castro would accept the criminals, and 3 days later, Havana announced that the prisoners had arrived in Cuba. On January 5, 2000, the Immigration and Naturalization Service reversed their original position that Elian was a matter for the state of Florida Family Court to decide, and announced that Elian must be returned to his father in Cuba. Was Elian the Clinton administration's payoff for Castro's acceptance of his criminals?
I think that there was very clearly an intention by the Clinton administration to cut some kind of deal with the Castro regime.
I believe that there is some sort of dialogue that has been occurring between both governments, but we'll never find out as there's so many secrets that are kept by this government.
The immense amount of public pressure that the U.S. government was inflicting on the Miami relatives of Elian was unconscionable.
What the administration did, and I think what most people don't realize, is that they could have chosen where they were going to apply the pressure to solve this situation.
It's always better when families work matters out between themselves. They do a better job than government.
My question from the beginning was, why wasn't the father by the child when the child first arrived to the United States? Again, these are questions that I believe could have been handled in a custody court in Florida, as opposed to giving absolute power and authority to Attorney General Janet Reno.
But we believe that the law is clear.
I would have expected that father to come to Miami immediately, within hours. That didn't happen. And it should make you think. It should make everyone think. Why was that father not here within hours? And the reason is very simple. Because that father was not free to fly to Miami. That father had to wait until the Cuban government decided that that is what needed to be done.
They could have pressured the Cuban government, and they could have pressured the people at the intersection to say, look, there's a Cuban Adjustment Act. Legally, this child could be given asylum based on that. We want to find out what the intentions of the father are. And we know that that father is not free to speak. That father disappeared for 4 months in Havana. That father has been under virtual house arrest in the United States, being a puppet of Greg Craig, a puppet of everyone who's handling him.
I think the handling of this case by the Clinton administration was really something tragic. I wasn't surprised by the way they handled it. I think I was more surprised by the way the American public accepted the Clinton administration's handling of this case. I'm very concerned for America. I'm very concerned for America's future when the executive branch can manipulate both the media and the courts and impose its will in ways that are of dubious legality and get away with it.
And that business of going to the Justice Department and sitting in a room with Janet Reno, sure, with Greg Craig outside and probably a driver from the Cuban intersection there, and his wife's son from a first marriage in Cuba, and trying to tell us that the father had a chance to defect. No, they should have applied pressure on the Cuban intersection, on the Cuban government, saying, we'll return the child after the father, the grandmothers, his wife's child from a former marriage, and everybody concerned meets with the family in Miami. We're going to bring the grandparents from Cuba, we're going to bring the other child from Cuba, and all of you can go to a house with Lázaro Gonzalez, Maris Laces, Delphine, and all of you meet independently without any pressure. And when you come out, you let us know what you want to do. And they never did that.
Lázaro, Elian's uncle, who was taking care of him, along with Maris Lacy, have both said that they would gladly return him to his father as long as it was a neutral location. They wanted sort of like a family reunification of the father with the extended family.
A lot of people may have thought that it was a paternity case with the Elian Gonzalez case. On the surface, that's what it may have appeared. However, it became a very political case, which became very unfortunate. To me, it was very clear-cut. Based on the Cuban Adjustment Act, the little boy should have stayed here in the United States.
There is a bond, a special, wonderful, sacred bond between a father and his son, one that I intend to uphold.
The tragedy of this is the fact that the families were not able to see each other, that the families were not able to talk without attorneys or politicians being involved in this process.
There was no reasons for politics to be involved. I think that what had happened was that the Cuban government forced the American government to make it a political case, and we fell right into the Cuban government's hands, and we made it a political case right along with the Cuban government.
Castro has blackmailed the administration before. In 1994, Castro not only threatened but created a refugee problem, which then the Clinton administration, because of that refugee problem, changed its immigration policy towards Cubans. So Castro has blackmailed the administration before. Castro created the Mariel crisis in 1980. This is an old tactic that Castro uses to blackmail the United States to do what it wants him to do. And it's very sad that we don't have a Cuba policy that would address that. Instead, we just kowtow to whatever demands Castro makes of our government.
Fidel Castro hates Americans. Castro hates the United States, and I believe that Castro used Elian to tell the Cuban people, we've won. The United States is not the best system. Communism and our regime is the best system. It is not a secret that he hates Americans. He hates everything the United States of America stands for. He hates a capitalist system. He hates our competitiveness. He hates our way of life. I believe that Castro used Elian to take away the problems that the Cuban people are facing due to his failed economic and political system. So he used Elian as an scapegoat.
As the highly politicized Elian saga played out, the Miami relatives of Juan Miguel Gonzalez, as well as neighbors in his Cuban hometown of Cardenas, stated repeatedly that Juan Miguel had told them he wanted to come to the United States and that he had requested a visa at the U.S. interest section in Havana.
Juan Miguel's plan to come to the United States and him requesting the 2 visas to come here is a definite sign that he was very interested in staying here in the United States and to unite himself with his Miami family.
They keep that woman's son in Cuba. They keep the grandparents in Cuba. And Juan Miguel knows if he messes up when he's here, that there are going to be consequences. And everybody knows this. At least Cuban Americans know this.
I think Juan Miguel probably just doesn't realize the options that he has. Unfortunately, we've seen that all those who've gone to visit him, all the people he's met with, have been people that basically have been trying to show the same point of view. And we feel that's unfair. We also are shocked that our government would not allow this man and his family to speak to other people who think differently. The American public has tried to simplify this issue as much as to see it as something between father and son. And I don't think anyone is advocating separation from father and son. However, I think Cuban Americans understand what goes on in Cuba a little bit better than the average American. If the average American were to understand what really happened in Cuba and would understand that in the Cuban Constitution it says that children are not the property of their parents but that of the state, and if Juan Miguel actually knew that Elian would be the new object of propaganda, the poster boy for the Cuban Revolution, he'd probably be having a second thought. And I think so would Americans about sending Elian back to Cuba.
Most Americans view it as an immigration issue. They don't want to look at the broader picture. I don't think they realize what it means for Elian to go back to Cuba and to be put back into a system where he's going to be utilized as a puppet to promote the so-called revolution.
Many people have said, well, if this was another country like Jordan, like Holland, how would we treat Elian? And I think that's the most insulting to me as a Cuban American, because the fact is Cuba is not Holland, Cuba is not Jordan. Cuba is a totalitarian state led by one person, Fidel Castro. And that kind of thinking is insensitive, because as a Cuban American, my identity is tied to the struggle for freedom in Cuba, because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be here. Cubans would not traditionally migrate to the United States in large numbers. So when people say, well, Cuba is just like any other country, they're really negating my identity as a Cuban American.
We realize that we're not fully American because there is sort of, there is that link that we have with Cuba. For a long time, we relied on our parents' stories, on our parents' struggles of searching for freedom. But I think we have an exceptional community because we're one of the closest communities understanding the ramifications of communism. We've realized that it's not only the responsibility of our parents to free Elian and his generation and free Cuba in general, but it's our responsibility as well. And who better than us can communicate to the American public and share our message of why we believe that there needs to be a free Cuba and why we believe that Elian should have stayed here in the United States and be granted the wonderful opportunities that we have had growing up in this country.
The day where Elian's parole expired, that day people were expecting the INS to come out and take the boy. Well, they didn't do it that day, but what happened instead was that you had a huge gathering of people gathered lawfully around the home. And I was following the newswire stories during the course of that day, and you saw just masses of people, and the crowd estimates kept growing and growing and growing. And you had a huge gathering of people there peacefully on the front of the house, demonstrating, exercising their First Amendment rights. It was probably the high point of this whole case was that day.
I feel for the families at hand, and I hope they can get together in a room privately and resolve this issue and let the son speak to the father and let the son express the wishes to the father. If he expresses the wishes to his father to go back, and that's between them. But up until now, he's only expressed the wishes to stay here and to seek asylum. I ask for the American justice system to please grant this child the ability to be heard, like we also proudly enjoy here. Thank you.
He is under no danger, There have been many people that in this community are viewed as supporters of the Cuban government that had come recently here. They have not been under any danger. They have not suffered any violence. Yes, there have been protests. That is, it is legal right to protest of any citizen in the United States. So this is what we wish to do here together as a Cuban American community, and anyone that cares to join us, to offer a peaceful hand to Elian Gonzalez's father to come and be with his family, be with his son, give him the time that needs to be for this transition to take place in the correct way for this boy. We want it to be clarified to us why this family, who has been guarding this boy, is being compelled to betray his trust and hand him over on a silver platter.
It's time we reunite them, and it's time we do it in a peaceful way. Elian deserves that. It has been 4 months since Elian was separated from his father and lost his mother. It is time for this little boy, who has been through so very much, to move on with life at his father's side. The law is very clear. A child who has lost his mother belongs with his sole surviving parent, especially with one who has shared such a close and a continuous relationship with his son.
He was not there to raise him. He didn't care much, except that he wanted to come over here to the United States.
The father waited, and the father wouldn't come for months and months and fuel this entire nightmarish controversy.
Castro came into the picture. They start harassing him there, and everything turned out to be that he is the father. He wants the kid back there.
The law is very clear.
I think she was referring to a law that existed in the United States 160 years ago. It was a law that said that any escaped slave from the plantation had to be returned.
What if somebody that is Jewish in a concentration camp will say, well, I want my kid here because I'm the father? No, you won't send it to the concentration camp. You make that kid get his freedom. So why was different with Elian?
But we believe that the law is clear.
The fact that Janet Reno consistently used that statement, the law is clear, is an example of the one-sided approach our government took to this matter. The law is anything but clear.
There was no definite law that Clinton and Reno appeared to be following. Everything was based on administrative policy.
This was a policy decision, and it was an ad hoc policy decision. Policy decisions are basically political decisions.
The law is very clear.
To say that the law is clear I think is dishonest. I think the law was not clear.
I am prepared to enforce the law, but I want to be clear that if we are compelled to enforce our order, we intend to do so in a reasonable, measured way. And it doesn't make much sense to tell you what our options are or the timing of them.
4 months passed before Juan Miguel Gonzalez came to the United States to claim his son in person. Evidence indicates that those 4 months were used by the Cuban government for indoctrination and programming by Castro and his security agents to ensure Juan Miguel's cooperation. When Juan Miguel arrived, he came with his wife and their infant baby, but not with his 5-year-old stepson, who, like the grandmothers and grandfathers, stayed behind in Cuba, thus preventing defection of the family. While in the United States, Juan Miguel did not go to Miami to visit his relatives and meet with his son. He stayed in the Washington, D.C. area, housed with an entourage of Cuban security agents, U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service agents, and local police at the Bethesda, Maryland home of Fernando Ramirez de Estenos, top man at the Cuban interest section in Washington.
The head of this so-called interest section, Mr. Fernando Ramirez de Estenos, he was appointed in 1986 to head the government of Cuba's interest in Angola, where he directed the use of chemical weapons, the use of chemical warfare against African troops in Angola.
Jesse Jackson goes to a social outing with the communist officials here in the United States, the Cuban interest section. He had cocktails with them during the Elian Gonzalez thing.
Every single democratic, civilized country has come out against the use of chemical weapons in wars. And in fact, in the last couple of decades, there only has been 2. Fidel in Africa and Saddam Hussein in Kuwait.
The day that we were protesting peacefully outside the Cuban intersection, the agents within the intersection came out as soon as the media was gone, and they started beating on the protesters.
I spoke to the press and I told them, these Cuban diplomats that attacked us are the same exact people that are already in custody of Juan Miguel Gonzalez. And these are the same people that will be in custody of little Elian if Juan Miguel takes custody of him here in D.C.
The Miami relatives invited Juan Miguel to a private family reunion with Elian, as they had attempted with the earlier visit of the grandmothers, free of Castro security agents, INS agents, police, lawyers, and news media, so they could talk freely and without any external pressure. Citing fear of public reaction, the Cubans refused the invitation, and no meeting took place. Disregarding the opinions of pediatricians, psychologists, and psychiatrists in direct contact with Elian Gonzalez in Miami, Attorney General Janet Reno called for the services of Dr. Erwin Redliner, a pediatrician and a longtime political activist with far-left associations and strong connections to Hillary Clinton and her ill-fated Clinton Healthcare Task Force of 1993. Dr. Redliner appeared on multiple television programs to declare that the Miami family home where Elian was living was a dangerous and psychologically abusive environment. His opinions and those of other physicians hired by the Clinton administration were widely distributed by the news media, although none of them had ever met or spoken with Elian Gonzalez. Ms. Reno had used a similar tactic in 1993 to justify the Justice Department's storming of the Waco compound.
The Clinton administration was trying to set up some of the Cuban exile people in Miami to portray them in the most negative light as possible, and with the help of the media, that's exactly what happened. So in my mind, it's not surprising that most Americans felt the way they did about the Elian case. It's just unfortunate and a real travesty that the media did this with the approval of the US government.
The behavior of 80% of the media in the United States was terrible on this. I mean, I think they just dropped the ball on this completely.
The role of the media is completely unacceptable throughout the Elian case. To me, the most important thing was not for the media to endorse either position. The role of the media is to report as neutral as possible what happened, and that clearly did not happen. The media very intentionally omitted very important developments in this case. For example, the media never portrayed the fact that Elian's grandmothers, according to their own statements, touched Elian's private parts and bit his tongue. The media never reported the Cuban diplomatic attack on U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. The media never focused on many important issues in this case.
Diane Sawyer comes from a very interesting position, which is as being part of the media and trying to approach it from a more critical standpoint. And yet after she met him, I think she really realized that that boy, Elian, should stay here in the United States and should live in freedom.
I think Diane Sawyer, that one report that she did, I think she gets very high marks for that report. By the way, Diane Sawyer is not allowed back into Cuba, at least that's my understanding. So that should be an indicator. Many other people are allowed back into Cuba, including people from CNN, and others, and actually welcome back because, of course, coverage may have been biased in that direction. If you look at some of the stories, people like Ted Koppel, who basically gave a free range to Janet Reno to put spins on it without question, which, of course, you know that Ted Koppel can really put people up against the wall and nail them if he wants to, and didn't. These three women, I don't even know what their names are, on MSNBC, who have that, very yuppie look with the little glasses, here judging Marislasis and making her look like a maniac. There was a lot of racism in a lot of shows that did not take Cuban culture into account. The Cubans tend to be very passionate.
The Dan Rather interview that took place in April here in the United States was a deliberate effort to remake the image of the father and to make him into a more appealing character. And it succeeded.
Dan Rather's interview with Juan Miguel Gonzalez was a very superficial interview. Dan Rather only asked Juan Miguel Gonzalez the kinds of questions that Americans were going to agree with the answer.
Dan Rather, interviewing Juan Miguel, said, "Did you weep? Did you cry?" I mean, things like that. That's not journalism. I mean, that's not even Larry King. That's not even Oprah, for goodness sake.
Dan Rather never asked Juan Miguel, "Didn't you say to the Miami family that Elian was going to Miami and that you wanted them to take care of him and that you also wanted to go to the U.S.? That he never asked him, "Were you harassed by the Cuban government? Is your family being held in a compound in Cuba? Are you afraid, Juan Miguel? Did you ever want to come to the United States? Do you love Fidel? Why do you think communism is better than democracy? Why do you want to raise your child in communism?" The interview was very simplistic and was geared only to further manufacture the American consent that the boy should be with the father.
My husband is a psychiatrist, and he was in the team that will take care of the group with Elian and the family members. My husband was there the day that they took Elian out of the house. He was the one that called me at 5 o'clock in the morning to let me know that they were taking Elian away.
We heard noises, people banging on the door, breaking the door down. Elian was awake in the living room, and we didn't know what was going on because they never told us the U.S. Marshals were going to come in and pick up the boy.
These people were negotiating with Janet Reno. This is the woman that said she wanted to be sensitive to little Elian.
We were on the phone with them negotiating. They put us on hold, and while we were on hold, they banged on the door. They broke everything in. They came in with guns, and Elian saw all of this.
They were all being held by guns in the kitchen.
Been there for the boy. We've always acted in good faith. They came in, they kicked the cameraman, they kicked everybody, they banged people on the head with stuff. When they came in, I stood in front of everybody and all my family was behind me, and I begged them, I beg you, please don't let the boy see the guns. Please, I'll give them to you. I told the lady that came in with a bag, with this bag, to stick them in the bag.
The people were coming, they're coming. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was dreaming. I jumped up and I seen Elian there, and I just grabbed him in my arms and I ran to the room to protect this little boy. And I seen men with assault weapons. I closed the door.
They put a gun right there.
They knocked the door down and they grabbed this little boy, guns in his face, a 6-year-old little boy.
Mom was pointing right to me. Give me the boy, give me the boy. There was a lady with a blanket. She took it, she put it over his face.
He was wide awake, he seen everything, and he was holding on to me, and he took him out of my arms.
Please, I looked at her eyes, please. He saw his mother's death because she's a mother, and she should know how that feels. Don't let him see this, I'll give you the boy. Give me the boy, give me the boy. I said, I'll give you the boy, don't let him see this, don't let him see this, please. We'll shoot you, we'll shoot you. We'll shoot, stand back, we'll shoot.
The violence here was not by the community, but by the federal government.
They threw a blanket over his head like they could suffocate the kid, and they just dragged him out of the house and they shoveled him into a truck here, and they backed out of here.
sending the federal marshals into the house of a working class family without finishing the negotiations was wrong. I think that the raid, in terms of taking Elian from the house in the forceful manner, was just not correct.
That raid, it was clearly unlawful. It was unwarranted. If you read the search warrant, find that search warrant was based on a false affidavit.
The raid was a perfect example of what Castro has done many, many times in his own country to remove innocent men or women and putting them in his political prisons.
That raid took place while negotiations were still ongoing.
And I still believe that there was communications going on between Janet Reno and not only Greg Craig, but the Cuban government as well.
My most serious indictment of Janet Reno at this point is that for someone who claims to be so honest and even-handed, she had a very hard time articulating the Cuban American position and the family's position. For someone who claims to be empathetic, she didn't display a lot of empathy. The law certainly did not authorize a raid to the home of a private citizen based on a false affidavit acquired fraudulently based on false evidence. In a way, it was the Pearl Harbor of civil rights here in the United States. At that moment of the raid, they still were within the laws. And yet, this raid, what it essentially did was derail the process of just a few days before. Circuit Court had said that there was no compelling reason to remove the child from that home at that time. People will say that the raid served the purpose of sort of waking up the American people to the kind of government that we have nowadays. I really wish that raid hadn't happened. I wish I could say that the government was trying to avoid that raid. I can't. Honestly, I think they wanted that raid. Part of the purpose of that raid was to terrorize the community and to so shock that community so as to immobilize them and prevent them from further trying to advocate for this child.
Attorney General Janet Reno did not participate in the cleanest way possible in handling this case. And my concern is that if these types of raids occur, not only in taking a Cuban boy, but if tomorrow it's taking a Haitian boy or a Peruvian boy or an American boy, we need to worry, and we need to speak up against these tactics that are used by the United States government.
I hope the American people someday understand what a travesty that raid was and what a terrible injustice has been committed against Elian and his family in Miami.
Apparently following Castro's instructions, Juan Miguel Gonzalez encouraged the Justice Department and the INS in the forceful removal of Elian from his relative's house in Miami, the same relatives he had asked to care for his son in previous telephone conversations.
I never heard or have I ever seen the American government get involved in I guess basically it came down to a domestic dispute. So I found that a very sad day in American justice, and I was very disappointed that one day to be an American citizen.
When you deny somebody freedom, that's a sad day in American history. They came and they snatched Elian during Holy Week here in South Florida, and that was no issue for them whatsoever. Send the boy back to slavery and to do so on the eve of Easter.
Sending armed guards in the middle of the night after Janet Reno had promised that she wouldn't do that. President Clinton promised Senator Bob Graham that he wouldn't send in people in the middle of the night. And he lied. Bill Clinton lied, Janet Reno lied, and they did it.
People say why the Cubans in Miami took it so personal. I think they misunderstood the whole situation. We were not against a family tie. We were against the government. And Elian has a mother that died trying to get freedom for him. And everybody talks about the father and Castro and the Cubans. But have they really thought about Elian's life? Have they really thought of what that kid would go through?
Many of the people out there in the streets had lived the childhood in Cuba. They had lived the forced labor camps in the countryside starting at age 11, with horrible sanitary conditions, separated from their parents, sexual molestation from teachers in those schools in the countryside. They knew what the indoctrination was in the schools. They knew the pressure. They knew what it was like to live there as a child. And they weren't paid attention to. They were made to look like some kind of mindless fanatics.
It was unheard of for West Germans to send back anybody back to East Germany after they had made it to freedom. And yes, the Cold War is over, but it's not over for the Cubans. Cuba still is communist. Cuba still has a totalitarian government in power. There's no freedom there. Things haven't changed there. It was funny though, after they took Elian from his Miami family, I think it was within hours, the cousin, Maris Lacey's, and the uncle were outside of the base where they were keeping him in seclusion. They were outside waiting. They would not allow them to see him or to have any contact with him.
It was here where the reindoctrination to communist ways of Elian Gonzalez began on U.S. soil, with the acquiescence of the Clinton administration and a security force paid for by U.S. taxpayers.
Y Mill was almost completely inaccessible. We actually went to Y Mills a week before he was taken to D.C. We took a boat out to Y Mills, and it was very long. It was like a 3-hour-long trip on that boat to get out there.
Then we started finding out about the psychotropic drugs that the Cuban nurses were trying to smuggle into the United States. God only knows what they were planning for the child. It was a sad, terrible ordeal for this community because we knew what would happen to him.
The Clinton administration permitted Cuban physicians sent by Fidel Castro without valid U.S. medical licenses to illegally practice medicine in this country. The physicians took charge of Elian Gonzalez while he was living in Maryland and Washington, D.C. One of the Cuban physicians, Caridad Ponce de Leon, was stopped by U.S. custom agents at the Washington Dulles International Airport on April 30th, 2000, for attempting to bring tranquilizers into the U.S. Were these mind-altering drugs to be used in the reprogramming of Elian?
What's really behind this is Elian not going back to his father, but being re-educated by the Cuban state, which, by the way, Castro already has pronounced and announced that that's what's going to happen. He has a house in Cuba ready for Elian, ready for psychologists and psychiatrists to come in and quote-unquote re-educate Elian. If past practice is any indicator, we know that they use drugs and other methods to re-educate people and to get them do what they want to do. Elian is not really going to have any kind of future in Cuba. He is going to be basically a figure for the revolution, and Castro has already alluded to this. So he is not going to have any kind of normal life in Cuba. He is not going to be able to develop into a regular human being. He is just going to be a propaganda material for the government, that the government will be able to use at will. And that's what's really at issue here. He is not going to go back to his father.
Back in April, about a week before the raid, I had seen a lot of police activity at a Youth for International Understanding Exchange Center. I became very suspicious, or at least I had an intimation that there was a chance that Elian might be staying there. I never really seriously contemplated having him so close to me, just a block away from my home. I started calling everyone I knew and saying, he's a block away from my home, and maybe sort of inviting suggestions as to what we should do. It seemed to me like a tremendous opportunity to have a presence there. And all of a sudden, the contrast of having him so close, just a block away from me. I walk out the door every day, and there you could see the activity, the police outside. So I guess my first reaction was a little bit of jubilation, because we'd had this child so remote from us for about a month, and all of a sudden there he is, practically dropped him on my lap.
Freedom for Elian! Freedom for Elian! Wake up, America! Freedom for Elian! Freedom for Elian! Freedom for Elian! We're not gonna give up! Freedom for Elian!
And under heavy police security, Elian's indoctrination sessions continued at this facility in Washington, D.C.
Within 48 hours that they moved into that house, that fence was put up. Tall wooden fence, 7.5 feet tall, right up against the front porch of the house. I was shocked at the speed that this was done. This is a historical property. It's on the National Historic Register. I found out a couple of days later that the National Historic Preservation Board had approved the setting up of this fence in a matter of 24 hours, whereas it usually takes months to approve any kind of renovation or structural change to a historic property. This was done in 24 hours. So it seemed to me like just another example of the double standard. This house dates from the 18th century, and we had this ugly, tall wooden fence that made the property look like a prison, something that was done by the executive branch with no consideration for the architectural integrity of the house or the feelings of the community. Elian's family in Miami tried to set up a privacy fence for him around his home in Florida, around the backyard, and the city of Miami required them to take that down because it was in violation of the zoning ordinance. And then, of course, the Miami relatives were then accused of parading the child and having him under the spotlight for 24 hours when, in fact, they had made an effort to respect his privacy. And yet they were compelled to take that fence down. And yet here we had this fence approved within 24 hours, no discussion from the community at all. Well, we went to this home. We basically followed the caravan north. We just wanted to see how he was doing. So we followed their little caravan out to Silver Spring, Maryland. I teamed up with a photographer from the Associated Press, and we pretty much tailed them up there. And we arrived there, and there was a big party going on. Basically, the entire personnel, the entire staff in the Cuban interest section was there, private residence, and they were basically having a backyard party. And it turned out that the next-door neighbor was Cuban-born. After a while, we spoke to the neighbor. He led us into his home, which was right next door. They were having their backyard party, and through the windows of the home of the neighbor, we were able to see Elian playing in the yard.
I saw Elian Gonzalez and Juan Miguel Gonzalez with the same people that attacked us in April. I saw them with the same exact people that violated not only U.S. laws, but international laws governing diplomatic relations. I saw them with their hands all over the Gonzalez family. I saw them watching every move of Elian on Father's Day.
He seemed to be surrounded by strangers. I mean, he didn't interact with any of the other adults, at least when I was looking at him. I couldn't help sensing a contrast with the scenes in Miami where he was surrounded by family, people who he was very close to.
An article by David Casares dated January 5, 2001 in the Sun Sentinel says, Miami employees of the Immigration and Naturalization Service were ordered to destroy or conceal documents and electronic mail related to the Elian Gonzalez case, according to a deposition by an attorney who represents INS workers.
On April 9, 2002, Judicial Watch, the public interest law firm that investigates and prosecutes government corruption, disclosed that copies of the documents INS Commissioner Doris Meisner had ordered be destroyed had survived. The documents revealed that the Clinton administration knew that Elian's father had sought to leave Cuba for the United States prior to the arrival of his son in the U.S., and that he was being coerced by the Castro regime.
The U.S. media very early on decided that it wasn't even going to look into the involvement of the Cuban government in this case. They really turned a blind eye to the manipulations of the Castro regime.
The media let the administration get away with this.
Very early on, all the evidence that was so crystal clear right in front of their faces.
And they were given these very sentimental images and simply were not told some of the things that were really going on.
That the father was being controlled by the Cuban government.
Or were not made aware of the alternatives.
I think they chose to ignore that. It didn't play into their own pre-existing notions of what the story they had that they wanted to transmit to the public. They learned that simple custody story was what sold and what got the American people's attention, and I think they deliberately downplayed anything that blurred the outlines of the custody story.
Cuban Americans knew very early in this process that they were suffering in a public relations sense, and that in the balance at the end, they were going to suffer even more. And yet they took to the streets, they fought, they wrote letters, knowing that the longer they carried this out, the worse the media would make them seem, and the worse the Clinton administration would make them seem. But they fought. One of my wife's uncles said, they gave us this hot potato to hold, and damn it, we held it. And we held it for a hell of a lot longer than they thought we were going to.
people would come up to me on the street and say, why are you demonstrating for this? Just let him go home. We're so tired of this. When the caravan left for the airport to go back to Cuba, the neighbors were applauding because they were so sick of this. What Americans don't realize was that their indifference is such a terrible indictment of America, or at least what the American people have become. It seems like they've forgotten the fact that America has fought world wars and shed so much blood so that children like Elian would not have to grow up in places like Cuba. The concepts of freedom, the concept of self-determination was forgotten, that this was really ultimately about freedom. It was not about personalities, or it was not a referendum on whether you like the Cuban American community or not. It was about a child's basic fundamental human rights, his right to grow up in a land where freedom prevails. I think it's tragic. I think it's tragic for America.
The day when they took Elian back to Cuba, at the house, there was all the neighbors gathered, and the neighbors were a bit split. There was the neighbors who would help us carry the signs of saying, Juan Miguel, goodbye to freedom, welcome to tyranny. And then there were those who, when they escorted the child out, were applauding and saying, goodbye, Elian, and very thrilled that the boy was finally leaving the neighborhood. Again, it was disturbing to see that the Americans just stood there and didn't understand the deeper issues. And I think that that's something that the media was unable to uncover, which was, why are we sending this boy back? It's like sending a boy back over the Berlin Wall. The day when Elian was taken to Dulles Airport to return back to Cuba with his father, the president from the Youth for Understanding came out with 2 letters. One was a letter to His Excellency, the President Fidel Castro, giving a small gift from the Youth for Understanding that values the country's culture and values. I found that to be a bit disturbing. I asked her the question, what about the human rights violations? What about the children being sent to the labor camps? And she just walked away. Definitely those were not the questions that the media was asking her. They found it to be wonderful and great that they were giving this gift to the Excellency Fidel Castro, which is definitely a slap on the face to the Cubans and to anyone who believes in human rights. What was sad was that this is an American woman who is valuing the country, who does what it does to its people, which is oppress its people. And I just find that to be disgraceful.
On Wednesday, June 28, 2000, after the Supreme Court refused the petition to be heard from a lower court, and the legal injunction keeping Elian in the United States expired at 4 p.m., Elian and his Cuban entourage were flown back to Cuba on a private chartered plane.
In the end, justice will be served, the truth will be known. It may take a long time, but the truth will be known. And I think the American public will realize at some point in the near future that our government committed a grave travesty in returning this little boy to Cuba.
It was a tragic and disappointing day for Cuban Americans and freedom-loving people. It was a dark day for America. It was the last insult to the memory of Elisabet Broton, Elian's mother, who died bringing her son to freedom in America.